Faith, a weight of memory, faith, a morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Frank Morrison's small apartment, casting long shadows across the walls lined with faded photographs. At 85, he had learned that some memories grow heavier with age, not lighter. The black and white images stared back at him from their modest frames. Young soldiers with hopeful eyes, men who would never grow old, faces frozen in a time when the world had burned, and somehow, miraculously, he had survived. Frank sat in his worn leather chair, the same one he'd owned for 30 years, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of old pipes settling in walls that had witnessed decades of solitude. His Social Security check covered rent and groceries, nothing more. Each month was a careful calculation of needs versus wants, and wants had been losing that battle for years. The chair bore the permanent impression of his body, worn smooth by countless hours of sitting, remembering, trying to forget. On the table beside him lay his daily pills, 7 different bottles with names he couldn't pronounce, each one fighting a different battle against time's relentless advance. High blood pressure, arthritis, the lingering effects of shrapnel that doctors had decided was safer to leave in place than remove. His arthritic hands, once steady enough to diffuse explosives under enemy fire, now trembled slightly as he set the mug on the side table. The VA doctor said it was normal for his age. Frank knew better. It was guilt, still finding ways to surface after 8 decades of life, still demanding payment for decisions made in the heat of war when survival trumped morality more often than he cared to remember. The photographs watched him with their eternal silence. Tommy Rodriguez, killed by a sniper outside Cassine. Jim Patterson stepped on a mine in the Ardennes. Mickey Cohen, no relation to the gangster he always joked, caught pneumonia in a foxhole and never made it home to his sweetheart in Chicago. Frank had promised each of their mothers he would tell them how their boys died. Heroes, he had said, fighting for freedom. He had told the truth, but not the whole truth. How could he explain that war wasn't noble when you were living it? Only afterward, when politicians and historians got their hands on the story. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet like artillery fire. He flinched, a reflex that never quite disappeared, then reached for the receiver with careful fingers. Even after all these years, sudden sounds could transport him back to battlefields where the next noise might be your last. Frank, it is Eddie. Eddie Chen, his neighbor from 2 doors down, was probably the closest thing to a friend Frank had left. Most of his war buddies were gone now, their names carved into stones he visited less frequently than his conscience demanded. Eddie was different, though, 2nd-generation Chinese-American, about 50, with a kind of patient respect that came from understanding what it meant to carry other people's burdens. "How you feeling this morning?" Eddie asked, though they both knew it was less a question than a daily check-in. "Same as always," Frank replied, which meant tired, achy, and carrying the weight of too many yesterdays. "What is on your mind?" "There is a storage auction happening today over at West Side Storage," Eddie continued, his voice carrying that careful enthusiasm people used around the elderly when they were trying to coax them back into the world of the living. "Thought you might want to get out, maybe find something interesting. You know, sometimes they have military stuff. Might bring back some good memories instead of—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Frank almost said no. He always said no these days. The world outside his apartment had grown too fast, too loud, too foreign. But something in Eddie's tone, or perhaps the way the sunlight was hitting that particular photograph of his unit outside Normandy, the one where he stood next to Sergeant Martinez, both of them grinning like the war was an adventure instead of a meat grinder, made him pause. The photograph had been taken 3 days before Martinez caught a piece of shrapnel that opened his chest like a flower. Frank had held him while he died, listening to him whisper about his daughter's first communion, how he hoped she would remember him in his dress uniform, not the bloody mess he was becoming on French soil. "What time?" Frank asked. "Fait among the living 2 hours later." Frank stood in the parking lot of West Side Storage, feeling small and out of place among the crowd of eager bidders. The facility sprawled across several acres, row upon row of metal doors that looked like garage doors laid on their sides. Each one held the remnants of someone's life, belongings that had once mattered enough to keep but not enough to keep close. Most of the bidders were younger, carrying notebooks and flashlights, speaking in quick, practiced voices about profit margins and resale values. They moved with the confidence of people who saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. Professional treasure hunters, Eddie had called them, and Frank could see what he meant. They evaluated each unit the way a general might survey a battlefield, looking for strategic advantage, calculating risk versus reward. Frank pulled his jacket tighter, not against the cold October air, but against the feeling that he didn't belong in this modern treasure hunt. The jacket itself was a relic. His old field jacket from the war, faded and patched, but still functional after all these years. Eddie had helped him into his truck, patiently adjusting the seat and mirrors, while Frank struggled with the unfamiliarity of driving anywhere beyond the grocery store. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a voice like a carnival barker, led the crowd from unit to unit. Frank followed at the back, listening to the rapid-fire bidding, watching strangers claim pieces of other people's abandoned lives. It struck him as sad somehow. All these forgotten belongings finding new purpose in the hands of people who would never know their stories. Unit 12 contained what looked like an entire household furniture stacked to the ceiling. Boxes balanced precariously on top of dressers, the accumulated weight of a lifetime compressed into a 10 by 10 space. The bidding was aggressive. Young men calling out numbers with the casual confidence of people spending money they could afford to lose. Frank watched an entire family's history get auctioned off for $300 to a woman who immediately began calculating shipping costs for the furniture. Unit 23 was smaller, filled mostly with holiday decorations and children's toys. An older couple won this one, their faces soft with recognition as they spotted a vintage dollhouse in the back. "For our granddaughter," the woman explained to her husband, though Frank could hear in her voice that they were really buying memories of their own children, now grown and scattered. As they moved deeper into the facility, Frank began to notice something strange. Many of the professional bidders had started to thin out, moving toward the exit with their purchases loaded into trucks and trailers, but a core group remained, following the auctioneer toward the back rows where the units sat in deeper shadow, away from the main thoroughfare. "These are the interesting ones," Eddie said quietly, appearing at Frank's elbow. "The units that have been here longest, where people paid the rent for years before disappearing. That is where you find the real stories." Frank nodded, though he wasn't sure what kind of story he was hoping to find. Part of him had come simply to get out of the apartment, to remember what it felt like to be among the living, instead of surrounded by photographs of the dead. But another part, a part he hadn't acknowledged even to himself, was searching for something he couldn't name. Purpose, maybe, or redemption, or simply proof that there were still mysteries in the world worth solving. Unit 47, Asterisk Unit 47 sat at the far end of the facility, tucked away where the afternoon shadows fell deepest. The auctioneer's voice had grown hoarse from the day's work, but he approached this unit with the same practiced enthusiasm he'd shown for the first. When the metal door rolled up with a rusty groan that echoed off the concrete walls, Frank felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Recognition. The unit was small compared to some they'd seen, maybe 8 feet by 10, cramped with the careful arrangement of someone who had known exactly what they were storing. Unlike the chaotic jumble of most abandoned units, this one showed signs of deliberate organization. Furniture had been positioned to maximize space. Boxes were stacked with military precision, each one labeled in neat handwriting that Frank could barely make out in the dim light. But there, pushed against the back wall and partially hidden beneath a paint-stained canvas tarp, sat something that made Frank's breath catch. The corner of an olive-green military footlocker, its brass corners dulled with age but unmistakable to anyone who had lived in barracks, slept in foxholes, or carried the weight of war in containers. Just like this one, Frank had owned a footlocker once, standard issue, built to hold everything a soldier owned that mattered. Letters from home, photographs, personal items that couldn't be replaced. His had been lost somewhere in the chaos of demobilization, left behind in a staging area in France when orders came through faster than personal property could follow. He'd grieved for that loss more than he'd ever admitted. Not for the objects themselves, but for the connection to a time when his life had purpose beyond mere survival. The bidding started at $50, the auctioneer's voice cutting through Frank's memories. He listened to the numbers climb. 70, 5, 100, 120, while his mind traveled back to a different time, a different world. Around him, the crowd was smaller now, maybe 15 people still interested in units, this far from the entrance. The professional flippers had mostly moved on, unimpressed by what looked like outdated furniture and military surplus that wouldn't sell well online, but Frank could see what they missed. The footlocker wasn't just military surplus. It was positioned with care, protected by that tarp, surrounded by enough space that nothing could fall against it or damage it during storage. Someone had placed it there with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. The kind of reverence that suggested the contents were more than just memories. At $140, the bidding stalled. The auctioneer's eyes swept the crowd, looking for any remaining interest. A young man with a smartphone raised his hand half-heartedly, more out of habit than conviction, behind him. A middle-aged woman checked her watch and shook her head at her companion. Frank felt his hand moving before his mind made the decision. 150, he called out, his voice carrying further than he'd expected. The sound of his own voice surprised him, stronger than it had been in months, carrying the kind of authority he remembered from giving orders under fire. Heads turned. A few people smiled indulgently at the old man with the trembling hands and the faded field jacket. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete walls and seemed to resonate somewhere deep in Frank's chest. Sold to number 23. As he walked forward to claim his purchase, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since the war. The weight of consequence, the understanding that his actions, his choices would matter to more than just himself. He didn't know why the feeling was so strong or what it meant, but for the first time in years he felt fully awake. Faye bringing home the past Faye that evening, Frank sat on the floor of his living room, the military footlocker positioned carefully in front of him like an altar. Eddie had helped him load it into his old pickup truck, both men struggling with weight that seemed far greater than wood and metal should have possessed. The footlocker was heavier than Frank, remembered such things being substantial in a way that suggested its contents had been chosen with intention. "You want me to stick around while you open it?" Eddie had asked, his concern evident in the careful way he spoke. Frank had shaken his head. Some things a man needs to do alone. Now alone in the quiet of his apartment with only the soft tick of the mantel clock for company, Frank studied the footlocker with the attention to detail that had once kept him alive in minefields. It bore no name, no unit designation, nothing to identify its original owner. But Frank could read the signs that others might miss, the scratches that came from hasty transport, the worn spots where hands had gripped it during countless moves, the careful repairs that spoke of someone who had valued what lay inside enough to maintain the container that protected it. The brass hardware was tarnished but functional. The corners showed the kind of wear that came from years of careful use, not neglect. Someone had taken care of this footlocker, maintained it, treated it with the respect that soldiers usually reserved for weapons or photographs of loved ones. The lock had been removed, cut off from the looks of the scratched metal around the latch mechanism. Frank's own hands trembled as he examined the latches, not from age or arthritis, but from something deeper anticipation. Maybe, or the kind of nervous energy that used to precede combat missions. His mouth felt dry, the way it had in the moments before jumping out of transport planes over enemy territory. The apartment felt different with the footlocker in it. Smaller, somehow, but also more complete. As if a missing piece had finally found its way home. The photographs on the walls seemed to lean inward, their subjects watching with interest as Frank prepared to open a container that might hold secrets from their shared past. With fingers that remembered steadier times, Frank lifted the first latch. It moved smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The hinges were well oiled, despite their age, suggesting recent maintenance by someone who understood the importance of preservation. The second latch followed, then the third. Each click echoed in the small room like a countdown to something momentous. Frank took a breath, said a small prayer to whatever gods watched over old soldiers and the secrets they carried, and lifted the lid. The revelation, the smell hit him first. Leather, metal polish, and something else. Something that transported him instantly to barracks and transport trucks and the controlled chaos of a world at war. It was the smell of organized military life, of equipment maintained and ready, of men who knew that their survival might depend on how well they cared for their gear. Frank's eyes watered, not from the musty air rising from the footlocker, but from the sudden, overwhelming rush of memory. Tissue paper rustled as he folded it back, revealing contents that made him sit back on his heels in wonder. The top layer contained uniforms, pressed and folded with military precision. But these weren't ordinary American service dress. These were German uniforms, Wehrmacht and SS insignia intact, arranged with a care that spoke of historical significance rather than casual trophy collection. Frank lifted the first uniform with reverent hands. It was an SS officer's dress uniform, complete with decorations and insignia, that he recognized from intelligence briefings decades past. The fabric was pristine, preserved in tissue paper and cedar blocks that spoke of professional archival care. Beneath it lay a Wehrmacht field uniform, its Feldgrow wool still crisp despite the decades. But it was the care with which these items had been preserved that struck Frank most forcefully. This wasn't the casual looting of a battlefield scavenger. Someone had cleaned these uniforms, documented them, treated them like museum pieces. Each one was accompanied by a small card written in precise handwriting, noting dates, locations, and circumstances of acquisition. Beneath the uniforms wrapped in oiled cloth, Frank found weapons, a Luger pistol, its metal still bright, despite the decades, nestled in a holster that showed the kind of wear that came from daily carry. Beside it lay a ceremonial SS dagger, its blade etched with runic symbols and Nazi slogans that made Frank's stomach tighten with remembered revulsion. These weren't just trophies, they were evidence of rank, of authority, within the machinery of genocide. Frank set the weapons aside with the same careful respect he'd once used handling unexploded ordnance, dangerous objects that commanded attention through their potential for harm, even decades after their primary purpose had ended. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from countless equipment inspections, taking over as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. But it was the items in the bottom of the footlocker that made Frank's hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with age. Small paintings, no larger than books, each wrapped individually in museum, quality cloth and acid-free tissue. Renaissance faces gazed up at him from canvases that had somehow survived artillery barrages, and burning cities, portraits of noblemen and merchants, religious scenes painted with the skill of masters whose names Frank didn't know, but whose talent was unmistakable even to his untrained eye. Beside the paintings, wrapped in what looked like part of an altar cloth embroidered with Hebrew letters, lay a collection of objects that made Frank's breath catch: gold coins, their surfaces bearing dates and denominations from a dozen different countries, jewelry with the weight and luster of genuine precious metal, religious artifacts, a silver menorah tarnished black with age, a Torah pointer delicate as a flower stem, a kiddush cup that caught the lamplight and threw it back in golden fragments. Frank knew what he was looking at. He had seen similar collections during the war, in the final chaotic months, when his unit had helped liberate concentration camps and secure Nazi command posts. These were looted treasures, art and gold and sacred objects stolen from Jewish families, synagogues, museums, the systematic plunder of an entire continent reduced to a few precious objects hidden in an American soldier's footlocker. But why had someone preserved them with such care, and why had they ended up abandoned in a storage unit, forgotten and unclaimed like any other piece of surplus equipment? Fathy Letterfay, the answer, came in a manila envelope tucked into the footlocker's lid pocket, secured with a rubber band that had grown brittle with age. Frank's hands shook as he opened it, careful not to tear paper that felt fragile as butterfly wings. Inside, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose time was running short, he found a letter dated just 3 years earlier. "To whoever finds this collection," it began, the words running slightly uphill across ruled paper as if the writer had been lying in bed while composing them. "My name was Robert Chen, Master Sergeant, 82nd Airborne Division, European Theater of Operations. I am dying now. Lung cancer from cigarettes and God knows what else we breathed over there, and I cannot carry these secrets any longer." Frank paused, his eyes returning to the signature. Chen, Eddie's last name. The connection hit him like a punch to the stomach, sudden and disorienting. Eddie had mentioned his father occasionally, a veteran who had lived quietly in the neighborhood for decades, keeping mostly to himself except for occasional conversations with other old soldiers who understood the weight of shared experience. The letter continued. "During the liberation of Munich in April 1945, I was part of a unit that secured Nazi Party headquarters in the government district. The regular troops had moved through quickly, but those of us in intelligence stayed behind to document what we found. In the basement of one building, we discovered a vault that had been hastily abandoned. The combination was still written on a scrap of paper taped to the door. Someone had been in such a hurry to evacuate that they'd forgotten to destroy the evidence of their hurry. Frank could picture the scene. He'd been part of similar operations, the surreal experience of walking through the remnants of Nazi power while the war was still being fought in other parts of the city. Buildings that had once housed the machinery of genocide, now empty except for scattered papers and the lingering smell of fear. Inside that vault, the letter continued, we found these items. Art stolen from Jewish families throughout Bavaria and Austria, gold and jewelry taken from synagogues and private collections, religious artifacts that had been catalogued for shipment to Himmler's planned museum of extinct races. The documentation was all there. Lists of original owners, locations of theft, estimated values. It was a bureaucrat's dream and a historian's nightmare, the systematic destruction of a culture reduced to inventory sheets and shipping manifests. Frank set the letter down, his eyes burning. He had known such things existed. Every soldier who had served in Europe after the camps were liberated had heard stories, seen evidence, tried to process the incomprehensible scale of what human beings could do to one another when ideology replaced conscience. But seeing it laid out in such personal terms, in the handwriting of a man who had struggled with these same questions for decades, made it real in a way that history books could never achieve. The letter resumed. I tried to find the owners. Spent years after the war writing letters, making inquiries through Jewish organizations and displaced persons agencies, but the families were gone, murdered or scattered to the winds. The synagogues were ruins. The communities that had created these beautiful objects had been erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Here, the handwriting grew even shakier, as if the writer had been struggling with pain or emotion. I couldn't bring myself to sell them. That would have made me part of the same system that had stolen them in the first place. I couldn't turn them over to the military authorities, who I suspected would have stored them in some warehouse until they could be quietly disposed of. And I couldn't destroy them, because that would have completed Hitler's work for him. Frank understood. It was the kind of impossible moral choice that war created, where every option carried consequences that could haunt a man for the rest of his life. Do the officially correct thing, and possibly see these treasures disappear into bureaucratic limbo. Keep them and live with the knowledge that you were harboring stolen property, or find some third way that honored both the law and the deeper demands of justice. So I kept them, the letter continued. Preserved them as well as I could, researched their histories, documented their provenance. I told myself I was protecting them until the right moment came, until I could find the right people to entrust them to. But decades passed, and I was no closer to solving the puzzle of where they belonged than I had been in 1945. The final paragraph was written in a different pen, with letters so shaky they were barely legible. If you are reading this, I am gone, and that responsibility now belongs to you. Do what I could not, find a way to return these treasures to their people. Not to governments or museums necessarily, but to the living representatives of the communities they were stolen from. Let them decide what should be done. Let them reclaim what was taken from their families. It has taken me 75 years to admit that I was never the right person for this task. Maybe you... Frank set the letter down with hands that barely functioned. Robert Chen, Eddie's father. The man Eddie had mentioned in passing. The veteran who had lived quietly in this same neighborhood for decades before his death. The storage unit had been rented in Robert's name. the payments continuing automatically from his bank account for 3 years after his passing until Eddie, overwhelmed by the task of settling his father's affairs, had finally let them lapse. The weight of understanding settled on Frank's shoulders like the pack he had carried across European battlefields 75 years earlier. These weren't just historical artifacts gathering dust in an abandoned storage unit. They were witnesses to one of humanity's darkest chapters, survivors of a systematic attempt to erase an entire people and their culture. For 8 decades, they had waited in darkness for someone to finish what Robert Chen had started. Faith Mission Faye over the following weeks. Frank discovered a purpose he hadn't felt since the war ended. The task that Robert Chen had been unable to complete became Frank's final mission, approaching it with the same methodical determination that had once made him effective at defusing unexploded ordnance. Each day brought new challenges, new discoveries, new connections to a past that reached across decades to claim him. He began with research, using Eddie's computer and the internet skills his young neighbor patiently taught him. The process was frustrating at first. His arthritic fingers struggled with the keyboard, and the flood of information available online overwhelmed him. But gradually, he learned to navigate databases of stolen art, Holocaust remembrance websites, and genealogical records that traced family lines scattered by war and genocide. Each painting told a story that Frank painstakingly reconstructed. The portrait of a young woman with sad eyes had belonged to the Rothschild family of Vienna, looted from their apartment after they fled to Switzerland in 1938. The religious scene showing Christ's crucifixion had been stolen from a Catholic church in Munich that had hidden Jewish families before being discovered by the Gestapo. A landscape painting of the Bavarian countryside carried the signature of a Jewish artist who had been deported to Theresienstadt and never returned. The gold coins came from at least 6 different sources: synagogues and private collections across Bavaria and Austria. Frank found records showing that some had been wedding gifts, passed down through generations of Jewish families until the Nazis' arrival made such traditions impossible to maintain. Others had been temple treasures, sacred objects used in religious ceremonies that dated back centuries. The work exhausted him physically, but it also awakened something he had thought was permanently lost: the sense that his actions mattered, that he could still serve something greater than himself. For the first time in years, Frank woke each morning with purpose beyond the simple maintenance of existence. He had a mission again, something that required his full attention and drew on skills he had developed over a lifetime of solving problems under pressure. Eddie proved invaluable as a research partner, bringing technological skills that Frank lacked and providing emotional support when the weight of what they were discovering threatened to overwhelm the older man. Together, they created a detailed catalog of each item, photographing them from multiple angles, researching their probable origins, and building files that would help connect each piece with its rightful inheritors. "Dad never told me about any of this," Eddie admitted one evening as they worked side by side at Frank's kitchen table, surrounded by photographs and printouts from their research. "I mean, I knew he'd been in intelligence during the war, but he never talked about what he'd seen or done. I thought he was just being modest." Frank nodded, understanding the silence that many veterans maintained about their wartime experiences. "Some things are too heavy to share," he said quietly. "Your father carried this burden for 70 years. He was protecting you from having to carry it too. But Frank also understood that some burdens couldn't be carried alone forever. Robert Chen had reached the end of his ability to guard these secrets, and now it was Frank's turn to take up the responsibility. The thought didn't frighten him. If anything, it gave his remaining years a weight and meaning they had lacked since his discharge from the army in 1946. Making contact through the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Frank made contact with Sarah Goldstein Meyer, a Holocaust survivor living in Brooklyn, whose grandfather had been the Munich art dealer. She was 89, older than Frank, and her voice broke when he called to describe the paintings he had found in Robert Chen's footlocker. I never thought I would see my grandfather's collection again. She whispered through the phone, her words carrying the weight of 8 decades of loss and unexpected hope. He loved those pieces more than anything except his family. He used to let me sit with him in his gallery while he examined them, teaching me about brushstrokes and composition. How you could read an artist's soul through the way they applied paint to canvas. I was 8 when the Nazis came and took everything. Frank listened to her story with the patience of someone who understood trauma, letting her speak at her own pace while he took careful notes. Sarah's grandfather, Marcus Goldstein, had been one of Munich's most respected art dealers before the war, representing both established masters and contemporary artists who were later banned as degenerate by Nazi cultural authorities. They came on a Tuesday morning, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories surfaced. I remember because I was supposed to have piano lessons that day, but grandfather canceled them. He said we needed to pack only what we could carry. Everything else, the paintings, the furniture, his books, even my grandmother's jewelry, had to stay behind. The Nazis had given him 24 hours to liquidate his business and report for deportation. The family had fled to Switzerland, leaving behind not just material possessions, but an entire way of life that had defined their identity for generations. Marcus Goldstein never recovered from the loss, Sarah explained. He lived another 15 years in exile, but his spirit had been broken by the destruction of everything he had built. When I saw your photographs, she continued, it was like seeing ghosts, not just the paintings themselves, but everything they represented. My grandfather's hands had touched these same frames. His eyes had studied every brushstroke, every detail. They were part of his soul, and now they've found their way back to us. Frank felt a tremor in his voice as he replied, Your grandfather's collection has been waiting 78 years to come home. I'd like to arrange for you to see them again. The reunion would take place at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, with Frank making the trip to New York despite his doctor's protests about the stress of travel. Eddie insisted on driving, renting a van large enough to transport the paintings safely, and accompanying Frank on what both men understood was more than just a delivery. It was the completion of a sacred trust. The reunion the Museum of Jewish Heritage sat on the southern tip of Manhattan, its angular architecture stark against the gray October sky. Frank arrived early, wanting time to prepare himself emotionally for what he knew would be an overwhelming experience. The museum staff had arranged a private viewing room where Sarah could examine her grandfather's paintings without the distraction of crowds or public attention. Sarah arrived in a wheelchair, her granddaughter Rachel pushing her carefully through the museum's entrance. At 89, she was tiny and frail, but her eyes held the alertness of someone who had survived experiences that would have destroyed weaker spirits. She wore a navy blue dress with a brooch shaped like a Star of David, and her white hair was pulled back in a style that reminded Frank of photographs he'd seen from the 1940s. Mr. Morrison? She asked as Rachel wheeled her into the viewing room. Her voice was stronger in person than it had sounded over the phone, carrying an authority that age had not diminished. Frank stood, feeling suddenly awkward and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to do. Mrs. Goldstein, Meyer, thank you for coming. I know this wasn't an easy trip. She studied his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading character in strangers. Call me Sarah, please, and thank you for what you are doing. I never expected to see these paintings again, not in this lifetime. Frank had arranged the paintings on easels around the room, each one carefully lit and positioned for optimal viewing. The museum's conservation staff had cleaned them gently, removing decades of accumulated dust and grime to reveal colors that glowed with renewed life. The first painting, a portrait of a Renaissance nobleman, stood directly in front of Sarah's wheelchair. When Frank unveiled it, removing the cloth that had protected it during transport, Sarah's eyes filled with tears that seemed to carry the weight of 8 decades. Her hands, trembling with age and emotion, reached out instinctively toward the painting before stopping short of actually touching the canvas. "It is exactly as I remembered," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather's hands held this same frame. He used to point out the way the artist had captured the light, falling across the subject's face. How you could see the painter's reflection in the man's eyes, if you looked closely enough." One by one, Frank revealed the other paintings, each unveiling accompanied by Sarah's memories of how they had looked in her grandfather's gallery, the stories he had told her about their creation and acquisition, the dreams he'd had of one day opening a museum where ordinary people could come to appreciate beauty regardless of their social status or financial means. He believed art belonged to everyone, Sarah explained as they moved from painting to painting, not just to wealthy collectors or museums, but to anyone who could find meaning in beauty. That is why the Nazis targeted his gallery specifically, not just for the value of the paintings, but because he represented everything they wanted to destroy. Culture that transcended nationality, beauty that spoke to universal human experiences, connections between people that couldn't be controlled by politics or ideology. Rachel, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the reunion, spoke for the first time. "Grandma, tell him about the violin." Sarah's face lit up with sudden joy. "Oh yes, the violin. We had to leave it behind when we fled, but I learned years later that one of Grandfather's assistants had hidden it in the basement of a church. It survived the war, and the church returned it to our family in 1963. I still play it sometimes when my arthritis isn't too severe. It is the only physical connection I have to my grandfather's world." Frank felt something shift inside him as he listened to Sarah's stories. This wasn't just about returning stolen property to its rightful owners. It was about restoring connections that the Nazis had tried to sever permanently, about proving that culture and memory were stronger than hatred and destruction. "There is something else," Frank said quietly, reaching for the wooden box that contained the religious artifacts. "These came from synagogues in Munich and Vienna. I am not sure which one specifically, but I thought you should see them." When he opened the box and revealed the silver menorah, the Torah pointer, and the Kiddush cup, Sarah gasped audibly. "The menorah," she breathed. "I know that menorah. It is from Oel Jacob Synagogue in Munich. My family worshipped there for 3 generations before the war." Frank carefully lifted the menorah from its protective padding and placed it in Sarah's outstretched hands. The weight of it seemed to surprise her, not its physical mass, but the emotional gravity of holding an object that connected her directly to ancestors she had lost and a community that had been destroyed. "My great-grandfather donated this to the synagogue in 1892, she said, her voice barely audible. It sat on the bima during High Holy Day services, lit by the rabbi as a symbol of God's eternal presence. I lit the Shabbat candles with my grandmother every Friday night, watching the same silver catch the same light that my great grandmother had seen. Faith the completion, the process of returning the artifacts to their rightful communities took months, but Frank approached it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that some missions require precision more than speed. Working with Jewish organizations across the United States and Europe, he traced the provenance of each item and identified living descendants or appropriate memorial institutions for their permanent care. Some items went to families like Sarah's, survivors, or their descendants, who could provide personal connections to the object's original context. Others went to synagogues and Jewish community centers that could incorporate them into religious services and educational programs. The paintings found homes in Holocaust memorial museums, where they would serve as testimonies to what had been lost and found again. The gold coins were donated to establish a scholarship fund for Holocaust education, ensuring that the wealth stolen from Jewish families would now support efforts to preserve their memory and teach future generations about the consequences of hatred left unchecked. Frank took particular satisfaction in this arrangement. It felt like a perfect inversion of the Nazis' intentions, transforming plundered treasure into instruments of remembrance and education. Throughout the process, Frank documented everything meticulously, creating a record that would satisfy both legal requirements and historical preservation needs. He photographed each transaction, maintained correspondence with recipients, and compiled a comprehensive archive that told the complete story of Robert Chen's secret burden and its eventual resolution. Eddie proved invaluable as a partner in this work, handling correspondence and travel arrangements, while Frank focused on the personal connections that made each return meaningful. Together, they visited synagogues, museums, and private homes across 3 states, personally delivering artifacts and listening to stories from recipients who had never expected to see such tangible connections to their family histories. "Your father would be proud," Frank told Eddie during one of their return trips from Boston, where they had delivered a Torah pointer to a synagogue that traced its founding to refugees from the same Munich community where the artifact had been stolen. Eddie nodded, his eyes fixed on the highway ahead. "I understand now why he kept this secret for so long. It wasn't that he was ashamed of what he'd done. He was overwhelmed by the responsibility of doing it right." Frank knew the feeling. The weight of other people's trust was heavier than any pack he had carried during the war. But it was also the most meaningful burden he had ever borne. Each successful return felt like a small victory against forces that had tried to erase entire communities from history. Winter light fell as winter settled over the city. Frank sat in his apartment looking at the now empty footlocker that had briefly filled his home with ghosts and purpose. The last artifact, a small silver wine cup from a Viennese synagogue, had been returned to a Holocaust memorial center the previous week, completing a journey that had begun in 1945 with Robert Chen's decision to preserve what others might have discarded or sold. The WWII check still covered Frank's rent and groceries. Nothing more. His hands still trembled when he held his coffee cup each morning. The photographs on his walls still showed faces that would never age beyond the youth captured in black and white images from another century. But something fundamental had changed in the quality of his daily existence. Letters of gratitude arrived weekly from families, museums, and scholars around the world. Each one was a reminder that some wars continue long after the guns fall silent, fought not with bullets, but with the simple determination to ensure that what was lost is not forgotten. Frank kept these letters in a shoebox next to his chair, reading them when the weight of his own memories grew too heavy to bear alone. Sarah Goldstein Meyer wrote most frequently, her letters filled with updates about how her grandfather's paintings were being displayed in the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and how school groups reacted when they learned the story of their recovery. "You've given me back more than art," she wrote in one letter. "You've given me back the belief that justice is possible even when it takes decades to arrive." The storage auction had cost him $150. What he found inside was priceless, not because of gold or art, but because it had given an old soldier one final chance to serve, one last mission to complete, one more opportunity to stand on the right side of history. Frank had always believed that his war ended in 1945 when he turned in his equipment and caught a transport ship back to New York. But Robert Chen's footlocker had taught him otherwise. Some battles continue across decades, fought by people who never wore uniforms, sustained by the simple conviction that wrong should be made, right regardless of how much time has passed. Eddie visited most evenings now, bringing dinner or simply sitting quietly, while Frank sorted through memories that felt more manageable now that they served a larger purpose. They talked about Robert Chen occasionally, piecing together the story of a man who had carried secrets for 70 years before trusting them to the randomness of a storage auction and the conscience of whoever might find them. "Do you think he knew?" Eddie asked one evening as they sat watching snow fall past the apartment windows. "When he rented that storage unit, do you think he hoped someone like you would eventually find it?" Frank considered the question carefully. "I think he did what soldiers do when they can't complete a mission themselves. He passed the responsibility to the next man in line and trusted that training and conscience would be enough to see it through." The thought comforted Frank in ways he couldn't fully explain. Military service had taught him that some duties transcended individual limitations, that the mission was larger than any single person's ability to complete it. Robert Chen had understood this, and in his final years had found a way to ensure that his unfinished business would find its way to someone equipped to finish it. On quiet evenings now, when the shadows grew long and the weight of memory pressed down like accumulated snow, Frank would read the letters of thanks that continued to arrive from around the world. Each one was a reminder that the past was not fixed and unchangeable, that patient work could still heal wounds that had festered for decades. The empty footlocker sat in his closet now, no longer needed but somehow impossible to discard. It had served its purpose, bridging the gap between one soldier's secret burden and another soldier's chance for redemption. Sometimes Frank would touch its worn surface and remember the moment he first lifted its lid, the way his life had suddenly acquired weight and direction after years of merely marking time. Epilogue, the continuing mission, Faye, and in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by photographs of men who had died young, Frank Morrison finally understood what the living owe the dead. Not grief, but action. Not regret, but remembrance. Not silence, but the courage to speak for those who no longer can. The war had taught him to follow orders, but peace had taught him something more valuable, that the most important missions are the ones you assign yourself, the battles you choose to fight when no one is watching, and no one will thank you except your own conscience. Robert Chen's burden had become Frank's purpose, and through that transformation both men had found a way to complete what they had started in the ruins of a devastated Europe so many years before. The stolen treasures had found their way home, the dead had been remembered, and justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Frank Morrison was 85 years old, and for the first time in decades, he felt like he had earned his place among the living.